She lost her hands to frostbite, but came back to climb Everest. The black stumps where her fingers used to be looked like charcoal against the white bandages. Tamae Watanabe stared at her hands in the hospital bed in Anchorage, Alaska, watching. The nurse changed the dressings on what remained of 8 fingers. The frostbite had eaten through flesh and bone like acid, leaving behind twisted bits of tissue that would never grip a rope again. She was 59 years old, and her climbing career had just ended on a mountain called Denali. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about prosthetics and desk jobs and learning to live with disability. But Tamae wasn't listening. She was already planning her return to the mountains. Most people lose their fingers and learn to open jars differently. Tamae Watanabe lost her fingers and decided to climb Mount Everest. She had been one of Japan's most accomplished mountaineers, with 27 major peaks under her belt and a reputation for climbing alone in conditions that terrified other climbers. Now she had stumps where her grip strength used to be, and everyone expected her to retire gracefully. Instead, she bought modified climbing gear and started training harder than she had in her 30s. The question wasn't whether she could still climb. The question was whether she could survive what climbing would do to her broken body. Every rope burn would tear open the sensitive skin on her stumps. Every ice axe swing would send shockwaves through bones that had been rebuilt with titanium pins. The margin for error had shrunk to nothing, because hands that can't grip properly can't save you when you fall. But Tamae had already decided that dying on a mountain was better than living safely in a world that felt too small for her. The story begins in 1999 on Denali, Alaska's tallest peak and one of the most dangerous mountains in North America. Tamae had climbed it twice before, but this time was different. She was attempting the mountain in winter, when temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and storms can last for weeks. The Japanese Alpine Club had warned her against going alone, but Tamae preferred solitude on the mountain. She said other climbers made too much noise and moved too slowly. She was wrong about being alone, though. The mountain had been waiting for her. The blizzard hit at 17,000 feet, just below the summit. Tamae had been climbing for 14 hours straight, her oxygen-starved brain making decisions that would have seemed insane at sea level. The wind was blowing at 80 miles per hour, and the snow was so thick she couldn't see her own boots. She should have turned back immediately. Instead, she kept climbing. The storm had turned her gloves into blocks of ice, and she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. She thought this was normal. Frostbite doesn't hurt when it's happening. It feels like nothing at all. By the time she reached her tent, the damage was complete. Her fingers had frozen solid, the cells crystallizing and dying while she was still climbing. She spent the next 3 days trapped in her tent, unable to use her hands for anything. She couldn't zip her sleeping bag, couldn't light her stove, couldn't even eat the food she had brought. She lay there watching her fingers turn black, knowing exactly what was happening but unable to stop it. The rescue team found her on the 4th day, barely conscious and hypothermic. They carried her down the mountain in a basket, and she never felt more humiliated in her life. The amputation surgery took 4 hours. Doctors at Providence, Alaska Medical Center removed 8 fingers at various joints, leaving her with 2 thumbs and the base of her right index finger. The surgeon told her she was lucky to be alive. Tamae told him she wished she had died on the mountain. She meant it. The person who had defined herself by her ability to climb impossible routes was now struggling to hold a coffee cup. Physical therapy felt like torture designed for someone else's body. She couldn't grip a pencil, couldn't button her shirt, couldn't tie her shoes. The world had become a place built for 10-fingered people, and she no longer qualified. But something happened during those months of recovery that nobody expected, least of all, Tamae herself. Instead of accepting her limitations, she began to study them with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. She watched how her stumps healed, how the scar tissue formed, how her grip strength developed in unexpected ways. She spent hours testing different objects, learning what she could hold and what she couldn't. She discovered that her stumps were actually more sensitive than fingertips in some ways, giving her better feedback about rock texture and ice conditions. The nerve endings that had been severed were growing back in new patterns, creating sensation maps that didn't exist in normal hands. She realized that her hands were different now, not necessarily worse. They were tools that required different techniques, like learning to climb with new equipment. The stumps could wedge into cracks that would be too small for fingers. The scar tissue was tougher than normal skin, resistant to cuts and abrasions that would stop other climbers. Her grip strength was concentrated in different areas, allowing her to hold positions that would exhaust climbers with full hands. She started to see possibilities where everyone else saw only problems. The breakthrough came during a visit to a prosthetics specialist in Tokyo. The doctor was explaining how artificial fingers would help her live a normal life, demonstrating how she could hold a coffee cup, or write with a pen. Tamae listened politely, then asked if he could design prosthetics for rock climbing. The doctor looked at her like she was insane. He explained that prosthetics were for daily activities, not extreme sports. Tamae thanked him and walked out. She had realized that she didn't need to live a normal life. She needed to live her life. The training began 18 months after the amputation, and it was unlike anything any climber had ever attempted. Tamae had custom climbing gear manufactured in Japan, working with engineers to design grips specifically for her hand shape. The process took 4 months and cost more than most people's annual salary. She practiced on small rocks near her home in Tokyo, learning to trust her modified grip on holds that would have been simple before. Every session ended with her stumps bleeding through the protective tape, the scar tissue splitting open from the stress of gripping artificial surfaces. She never stopped early. She climbed until her hands gave out, then bandaged them and planned the next day's training. Her climbing partners thought she was having a breakdown. They watched her struggle with routes she had completed easily before the accident, saw her fall repeatedly on climbs that should have been routine. They suggested she try indoor climbing, or perhaps hiking, or maybe just enjoying nature without the need to climb it. They didn't understand that she was having a breakthrough. Each failed attempt was teaching her something new about how her modified hands worked. Each fall was data she could use to improve her technique. She developed a training system that no climbing manual had ever described. She practiced gripping objects of different sizes and textures, building strength in muscles that had never been used for climbing. She learned to compensate for her reduced grip strength by using her whole body more efficiently. She studied how to distribute weight across her stumps without causing tissue damage. She practiced rope work until she could secure herself faster than most climbers with full hands. The techniques she developed were so unique that other climbers couldn't even understand what she was doing. The psychological training was harder than the physical preparation. Tamae had to overcome 25 years of muscle memory that told her to grip with fingers that no longer existed. She had to learn to trust equipment that felt foreign on her hands. She had to accept that she would never again have the safety margin that full hands provided. Every climb would be more dangerous, every hold more uncertain, every decision more critical. She had to rewire her brain to think like a climber who couldn't afford to make mistakes. The first test came on Mount Fuji in 2001. Tamae climbed Japan's highest peak using only her modified gear, completing the route in conditions that challenged climbers with full hands. The climb wasn't about reaching the summit, it was about proving that her new hands could work on real rock. She descended that mountain knowing she could climb again, but more importantly, knowing she could climb differently. The old Tamae had relied on brute grip strength and technical precision. The new Tamae had to be smarter, more efficient, more creative. She had to become a better climber than she had been before. The Everest decision came in 2002. Tamae was 63 years old, had 8 missing fingers, and hadn't climbed a major peak in 3 years. By every logical measure, attempting the world's highest mountain was suicide. The death zone above 26,000 feet kills healthy climbers in their prime. The technical climbing sections require precise hand placement on rock and ice. The weather conditions regularly destroy experienced teams with full equipment, but Tamae had stopped thinking logically about climbing. She had started thinking about it as a conversation with death that she wasn't ready to finish. The preparation took 2 years. Tamae trained 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, rebuilding her cardiovascular system and adapting her technique to work with prosthetic climbing aids. She practiced rope work until she could secure herself faster than most climbers, with full hands. She studied weather patterns, route conditions, and emergency procedures with the intensity of someone preparing for war, because that's what Everest was for her. A war against everyone who thought her climbing days were over. The 2004 expedition almost killed her twice. The first time was at 24,000 feet, when her oxygen regulator malfunctioned during a storm. With numb stumps, she couldn't operate the backup system quickly enough. Her climbing partner had to remove his own gloves in -20-degree weather to fix her equipment. His fingers were frostbitten by the time he finished. The second time was during the final summit push, when exhaustion and oxygen deprivation made her lose her grip on a fixed rope. She fell 12 feet before her. Safety line caught, slamming her into the ice wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs. She climbed the rest of the route with broken ribs and hands that barely functioned. On May 16, 2004, at 11:20 a.m., Tamae Watanabe stood on the summit of Mount Everest. She was 63 years old, had 8 missing fingers, and had just become the oldest woman to reach the top of the world. The summit photos show her holding a small Japanese flag with her modified grip, tears freezing on her cheeks inside her oxygen mask. She stayed on the summit for exactly 3 minutes, long enough to take the photos and prove to herself that she had actually made it. Then she began the descent, which she knew was more dangerous than the climb up. The The descent took 14 hours and nearly killed her 3 more times. Tamae's stumps were so damaged from the climb that she couldn't grip properly anymore. Blood was seeping through her climbing gloves, mixing with ice to create a slippery mess that made every handhold dangerous. She had to be short-roped by her climbing partner for the most technical sections, essentially being guided down like a novice climber. Her pride was destroyed, but she was alive. At Camp 4, she collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to her tent. The altitude sickness hit her harder than it had on the way up, and she spent 6 hours vomiting while her body tried to process what she had just accomplished. The real danger came during the Khumbu icefall descent. This section of the route is a maze of shifting ice blocks and hidden crevasses that kills more climbers than any other part of Everest. Tamae's damaged hands couldn't operate her safety equipment properly, and she fell through a snow bridge into a crevasse. She dangled there for 27 minutes, spinning slowly on her rope while her team figured out how to extract her. The walls of the crevasse were so narrow that she couldn't use her ice axes, and her stumps were too damaged to grip the rope for self-rescue. She hung there watching her breath freeze in the blue-white light, calculating how long her rope would hold her weight. When they finally pulled her out, she was hypothermic and barely conscious. Her core body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees, and she was showing signs of cerebral edema. The expedition doctor wanted to helicopter her off the mountain immediately, but the weather was too bad for evacuation. She spent the next 18 hours in base camp medical tent, connected to an IV and breathing supplemental oxygen. Her hands were so frostbitten that the medical team couldn't find veins for the IV line. They had to insert it through her foot. She reached base camp with frostbite on her stumps, adding new scars to the collection she had started on Denali. The doctors at base camp told her she would never climb again. She told them she would be back. 9 years later, she proved them wrong again. In 2013, at age 73, Tamae returned to Everest for her second summit attempt. The climbing world had declared her first ascent a fluke, a lucky accident that couldn't be repeated. She was now the oldest person attempting the mountain, with hands that had been damaged by 2 decades of extreme climbing. The expedition was supposed to be a farewell tour, a chance to say goodbye to the mountain that had given her a second career. Instead, it became the climb that established her legacy. The preparation for her second Everest attempt was more brutal than the first. Tamae's body was 9 years older. Her cardiovascular system was showing signs of wear, and her stumps had developed arthritis from constant use. She trained in a hypoxic chamber for 6 months, simulating the oxygen-depleted conditions of high altitude. She practiced technical climbing moves until her stumps bled through the protective gear. She studied new route conditions, memorized weather patterns, and planned contingency strategies for every possible emergency. The Japanese Alpine Club tried to talk her out of the attempt, calling it an unnecessary risk. She told them risk was the only thing that made life worth living. The 2013 expedition team was half the size of her first attempt. Tamae insisted on a minimal crew, arguing that more people meant more variables she couldn't control. She climbed with 2 guides, a photographer, and a doctor who specialized in high-altitude medicine. The team carried emergency oxygen, satellite communication equipment, and enough supplies for a 6-week expedition. They also carried a modified stretcher, because everyone except Tamae expected her to need evacuation before reaching the summit. The route conditions were worse than 2004. Global warming had destabilized sections of the Khumbu icefall, creating new crevasses and unstable seracs that hadn't existed during her first climb. The jet stream had shifted, bringing unpredictable weather patterns that made summit timing nearly impossible. 3 expeditions had already turned back due to dangerous conditions. Tamae studied the weather reports and decided to attempt the summit during a narrow window that other teams considered too risky. The second summit was harder than the first in every measurable way. Tamae's body was 9 years older. Her hands were more damaged, and the route conditions were worse. But her technique had evolved into something approaching perfection. She had learned to climb with efficiency instead of strength, using her whole body to compensate for her grip limitations. She moved up the mountain like someone who had spent 20 years studying every possible way to climb with broken hands. Her rope work was faster than climbers with full hands. Her route finding was more efficient than guides who had climbed Everest multiple times. She had become a climbing machine optimized for her specific limitations. The summit push began at midnight on May 18, 2013. Tamae climbed for 19 hours straight, moving through sections of the route that had claimed the lives of younger, stronger climbers. The Hillary Step, a 40-foot vertical rock face near the summit, had become more technical due to changing ice conditions. Tamae negotiated this section using a technique she had developed specifically for her stumps, jamming them into cracks and using her body weight to maintain position. It took her 43 minutes to complete a section that typically takes 15 minutes. She didn't care about the time. She cared about reaching the top alive. On May 19, 2013, at 9:32 a.m., she reached the summit again. This time, she was 73 years old and had just become the oldest woman to summit Everest twice. The summit photos show her holding a prayer flag with her modified grip, her oxygen mask covered in ice crystals, her eyes showing the exhaustion of someone who had pushed her body beyond its design limits. She stayed for 5 minutes, long enough to complete the religious ceremony she had planned, and to prove to herself that she could still reach the highest point on Earth. The descent was a controlled disaster. Tamae's stumps were so damaged from the climb that she lost feeling in them completely. She had to climb by sight alone, watching her hands instead of feeling them. The lack of sensation made every handhold dangerous, because she couldn't tell if she was gripping properly. She fell twice during the descent, saved only by her safety ropes and the quick reflexes of her guides. By the time she reached base camp, she had lost 15 pounds and developed altitude sickness that required immediate medical attention. She spent 3 days in the base camp medical tent, connected to IV fluids and breathing oxygen. The expedition doctor said she had pushed her body closer to death than any climber he had ever treated. The climbing world finally understood what Tamae had been trying to prove. She hadn't overcome her disability. She had transformed it into a different kind of strength. Her stumps had become tools specifically designed for her style of climbing. Her modified technique had made her more efficient than climbers with full hands. Her experience with pain and limitation had given her a mental toughness that couldn't be taught in any training program. She had become exactly what she set out to become, a climber who was defined by what she could do, not by what she had lost. Today, Tamae Watanabe is 84 years old and still climbing mountains that would challenge climbers half her age. She has summited major peaks on every continent, using techniques that have influenced how adaptive climbing is taught worldwide. Her modified gear designs are used by other climbers with disabilities. Her training methods are studied by sports psychologists who want to understand how the human mind adapts to extreme limitations. She has written 3 books about climbing with physical limitations, and she still trains 4 hours a day in a gym she built in her Tokyo apartment. When people ask her about retirement, she tells them she will retire when the mountains get tired of her. The climbing community has finally accepted what took them decades to understand. Tamae didn't overcome her disability through inspiration or determination. She overcame it through obsessive technical innovation and a willingness to rebuild her entire approach to climbing. She studied her limitations like an engineer studying design constraints, then developed solutions that worked within those parameters. Her success wasn't about beating the odds. It was about changing the game entirely. She still climbs technical routes that stop other climbers, moving up rock faces with a fluid efficiency that looks effortless. She can secure a rope faster than most guides, set protection more efficiently than climbers half her age, and navigate technical terrain that stops other climbers completely. Her stumps have developed calluses that look like armor, shaped by 30 years of technical climbing into tools that are more specialized than the fingers she was born with. She reads rock texture and ice conditions through nerve endings that have been trained to process information that normal hands can't detect. The medical establishment still considers her an anomaly. Doctors study her case files, trying to understand how someone can climb at an elite level with such severe hand trauma. They analyze her grip strength, her proprioception, her pain tolerance, looking for explanations that fit their understanding of human limitations. They miss the point entirely. Tamae doesn't climb despite her injuries. She climbs because of them. The frostbite forced her to become a better climber than she had ever been before. Her legacy extends beyond her own climbing achievements. She has inspired a generation of adaptive athletes who refuse to accept that physical limitations must define their possibilities. She has proven that the human body can adapt to almost any constraint if the mind is willing to do the work. She has shown that what looks like an ending can be transformed into a beginning if you're willing to completely reimagine what's possible. The stumps where her fingers used to be are now covered in calluses that look like armor. They are tools that have been refined by 25 years of technical climbing, shaped by rock and ice into instruments that work better than the hands she was born with. She can secure a rope faster than most guides, set protection more efficiently than climbers half her age, and navigate technical terrain that stops other climbers completely. The frostbite that was supposed to end her career became the beginning of her legend. Tamae Watanabe lost her fingers to a mountain in Alaska. She responded by conquering the highest mountain on Earth twice. She didn't just survive catastrophic injury, she used it to become one of the most accomplished climbers in history. Her story isn't about overcoming disability, it's about transforming limitation into strength, turning what should have been an ending into the beginning of something extraordinary. She proved that the human spirit doesn't need 10 fingers to reach the top of the world. It just needs the refusal to accept that The story is over.